So Marvin, you were interviewed by me 25 years ago on radio. Here we are in person on the American Leadership Tradition, subtitle Moral Vision from Washington to Clinton. Couldn't help but thinking you and I have changed a bit. Nice little picture there of this is pre-gray for both of us.
That's right.
And now you come out recently with Moral Vision. So the subtitle of the previous book uses now the title of this book, Moral Vision, Leadership from George Washington to Joe Biden. Why redo, expand the book? What was that decision like?
Well, there were a couple of things I thought that I had underplayed that are important in American history, particularly race relations. So I went back and, with the help of the internet these days, learned a lot more about the people I'd written about before. And then I also thought there were important people to add. For example, if you go to the late 19th century, Ida B. Wells, one of my favorite journalists ever, a very brave black woman who shone a spotlight on lynching. There were several people like that I wanted to do. So the title change, I think, is just to differentiate it from the earlier book, because again, there's much more on a lot of the individuals, particularly dealing with race, and then there are new people brought in, as well as the more recent folks, Bill Clinton, who I just touched on at the last chapter of the former book, but now there's, of course, Newt Gingrich, I wanted to get into that, and Donald Trump and Joe Biden.
Now, by my count, the new edition has a baker's dozen plus one, 14 presidents, and I believe 6 non-presidents. How did you make those decisions on both sides of that? Because obviously 14 is not all our presidents, and as far as outside leaders, that could be hundreds, thousands of decent picks.
Well, in college, a little more than half a century ago, I read Richard Hofstadter's book, which deals with lots of mostly presidents in American history.
American political tradition.
American political tradition. I wanted to basically look at it from a different perspective. So my original selection was to a large extent based on Hofstadter. For example, he did presidents. He also did Henry Clay, the fellow who ran for president 3 times, and people expect him to be elected. So I did Henry Clay also. He was a fascinating guy. The additions were just people that I was particularly interested in. Well, with one difference. One critic of the first book noted that I was dealing with Democratic presidents, largely in the 20th century, who I was sharply critical of. And, weren't there any good Democratic presidents? Weren't there any bad Republican presidents? Well, of course. But I wanted to do something on Harry Truman, a guy I didn't know much about, fascinated me, so I wrote a chapter on him, trying to, in a sense, show, yes, you're not good if you're by being a Republican, and you're not bad by virtue of being a Democrat, of course. But just wanted to allay that concern. And then also I wanted to go back in this new thing and look more at something I had read about, heard about, but never really looked into, what's come down in history as the Trail of Tears from the 1830s. And so I wanted to look at the relations of settlers and Native Americans from Washington up through Martin Van Buren.
So Marvin, I want to read your book back to you.
Okay.
Not the whole thing, just a short paragraph.
Thank you.
And talk about character, because obviously that's a big part of this book. What is it? How does it operate? How germane is it to being president, an effective president? We'll talk about that a little bit. But at the end of the book, you say, and I think this is very well put, a key question at the end of the 18th century was whether a potential president, like a well-weighted sailing ship, had, quote, bottom to provide stability and strong winds. The Oxford English Dictionary defines bottom as substance, strength of character, dependability, and says, quote, the usage is somewhat archaic. That's true in political reality as well. So I know you can't, it's not fair for me to say, okay, Marvin, I'm putting you on the spot, define character, give me your elevator pitch on character. We're not going to do that. You can take maybe 30 seconds longer. So an elevator and a half. What is character? It seems a little bit like liquid zinc. It's kind of slippery. People define it differently. How would you say character should be defined? Like, what would be the irreducible minimum? You go, that person is a person of character based on what I'm thinking about these traits, and that person, I don't know if they're a person of character.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you an elevator pitch about bottom
Okay.
in relation to seasickness. I took a freighter half a century ago across the Pacific and wondered going into that whether I would be seasick, and found out not at all, because it was loaded with Canadian lumber, which made the bottom of the ship heavy enough so that there was very little rocking back and forth. So I'd make that analogy to leadership in a country. When you have a president or presidential candidates who basically whipsaw, a whole country in a way can get seasick. You don't know what to expect from day to day. So part of character is consistency, having some courage, being willing to stick with a position, even if people initially squirm about it. And that, I think, is really important in a president. We have a huge amount of instability in our culture right now because of family breakdown, because of lots of other things going on in the culture, including being whipsawed by internet back and forth all the time. It's good to have a leader who actually shows some consistency, some courage, someone who has bottom. And that's what we desperately need right now. And Harry Truman was a good example of a president who had bottom. And I think now we could sing, where have you gone, Harry Truman? A nation turns its lonely eyes to you.
Well, I want to read. I mentioned on a couple of our walks that I did a big deep dive into the Federalist Papers last year, and I'm going to read from John Jay. He, as you know, he only did 5 of the Federalist Papers because he got sick, so most of them were done by Hamilton and Madison. But this I found, so revealing when I was reading it early on in Federalist 3, and I want to ask you about it. So Jay says, when once an efficient national government is established, and obviously they're making the case for a stronger, federated government, not just this loose group of states, but really to have a central government, arguing that when once an efficient national government is established, the best men in the country will not only consent to serve, but will also generally be appointed to serve. So it's a both-and deal. We got a deep bench, ample people that are going to serve, and we also have a wise country. They're going to vote these folks in. And later on, the Federalist Papers in Federalist 45, Madison basically says the same thing. He doesn't use the language, but in essence, he's saying, hey, we're glutted with virtuous people. We got a lot of people that are going to serve at the local level, federal level. What happened?
No, that's a really good question, because they said, we have lots of virtuous leaders here. This was a country of 4 million people.
Right.
Now, of course, we're over 300 million, and yet it seems that the only 2 people running for president this year in major parties are both very elderly people, and I'm not at all against elderly people since I'm there and you're getting there, but it's a little fearful having a person of that age and mental capacity perhaps as president of the United States. So that's really strange that we can only find 2 such people, and then are they virtuous people? One of the problems, I'd say, trying to relate that, the concerns of the Federalist writers to the present, is that not only Donald Trump lacks character, as they, I think Jay and Madison, if they were around today, would certainly point out, but a whole lot of people with character saw what happened during his first administration, and they are going to be unwilling to serve. A lot of people during the first administration, good solid people, said, well, I don't particularly care for Trump, but someone has to be the adult. I need to do it for the country, even though I can see problems here. Well,
Yeah.
they've learned that they were either fired or had to resign. So it's going to be really hard if there's a second Trump administration to find virtuous people in the administration. So that's a point that's directly relevant to our own political situation. Now you ask why. I don't really know. I can see that thoughtful people don't want to expose themselves and often their spouses and families to what goes on. I can see that we have a government, even our debates are not really debates, they're just exchanges of sound bites. And then you have all the caricaturing that goes on without any adult supervising on TikTok and Facebook and everything else. So I can certainly see why a person would have to be bold and courageous to want to subject himself to that. Certainly, as the Federalist writers knew, there's a lot of ambition around, and perhaps a person's ambition will overcome those concerns, and often it should, but we are in a very sorry state right now.
Yeah, I often think about that well-known quip of Buckley's, you'd rather be ruled by the first 2,000 people in the Boston phone book than by who we have today. And I think in the private sector, we obviously do have some very significant people, but they look at the process, the money, et cetera, and they're going, I'm out. I don't want to do that. Let's talk about compromise for a while here. So politicians, to get stuff done, have to make deals, have to find okay, like on a Venn diagram, we're going to kind of have mutual shading here. We can compromise. And yet, we don't want them to be crass compromisers. We want them to be still men of character or women of character. We want that. And I often think about Jesus' words in Matthew 10, that he sends us out as sheep in the midst of wolves, therefore be shrewd as serpents, innocent as doves. And I've done a thought experiment in different places where I've spoken and said, how many of you know Christians, when I explain what shrewd means, having street smarts and not being unscrupulous or unethical, but just understanding human nature, the dark side. How many of you know Christians who are shrewd as a serpent? Everyone raise their hand. Great. How many of you know Christians that you feel like have no guile, they're innocent as doves? All hands go up. So neither one of those questions is what I'm really interested in. What I'm really interested in is, who do you know that embodies both very highly? They're both shrewd as a serpent and innocent as a dove. I have had no hands yet. Okay? So it seems to me that we get to the so-called political sphere, and we don't, and local people want, representation, meaning we want you to represent our interests, basically. And there's a whole nother talk we could have about how that's changed, what representation means, but without going into that. But we want you, Mr. or Mrs. Politician, to represent our interests. So we want some things to happen tangibly, feet on the ground stuff. And yet, I don't think if you went to those people and said, well, do you want them just to make deals willy-nilly and character doesn't matter? You go, no, but we do want both. We want them to be a deal maker, make enough compromises, but not lose their character in the midst of it. How does that play out in your estimation, not only with some of the presidents you've talked about here, but just also in the times we live in right now?
It's a good question. Rather than sit high on the ladder of abstraction, I'll give you a specific example.
Okay.
Again, Harry Truman, I've been thinking about him because his 140th birthday, if he were still alive, is May 8th. He was born on May 8th, 1884. So that's coming up. Harry Truman was an artillery captain during World War I. His fiancée, Bess, who he married after the war, and they stayed married for 53 years until Harry Truman died, was a little bit worried about Harry with the French mademoiselles. So he wrote her a letter at one point saying that he was resolved to remain, and this is a lovely quotation I thought, is 2 words here, reasonably pure, end quote. I'm not quite sure what that meant, but apparently it satisfied Bess, and Truman was known for not running around with women. If he was meeting someone in a hotel room, this actually happened, and a political ally, and a woman, a blonde in a negligee, opened the door, Truman ran down the corridor as fast as he can. He was with a friend who reported that, and there were other instances of that. So he was very concerned morally about this. Now, how did this translate into politics? Truman got elected from Kansas City because a fellow named Jim Pendergast became his political patron. Pendergast was really corrupt. He made deals, he stole money, he had a lot of people working for him. I mean, they had stolen elections, which really helped Truman at that point in the 1930s. Truman ran for senator and won in 1934 with the help of Jim Pendergast. Pendergast wanted Truman to do his bidding in Washington. Truman said, no, I'm going to vote the way I think is right, and I'm going to vote to represent all my Missouri constituents, not you, Jim. But at the same time, Truman got a Pendergast ally appointed as head of the welfare administration job creation programs in the 1930s. So the Pendergast was able to do his patronage, but he wasn't able to decide, he had no input whatsoever into how Truman would vote. So there's an example of Truman, in a sense, remaining reasonably pure. I mean, there was going to be someone who was going to be deciding which people in Missouri would get these government jobs and which would not. And so he said, okay, I'm going to do that. I mean, you're still going to have people who are qualified, but it's going to be people who you are their patron rather than others. And so that's not fair, but I'm not going to give you any voice whatsoever in legislation. So he's remaining reasonably pure. Let me go back a moment. When Truman was basically a county executive, and there were road contracts, building contracts, and things like that. Truman once was called into a meeting with Jim Pendergast with 3 contractors for highway building who were really mad because they had not gotten contracts that Truman was administering, and they figured they would do them because they were Pendergast allies. And Pendergast said, what do you mean not giving these guys contracts? And Truman said, no, I'm not going to give them to them because they are inflating their prices and their quality is not sufficient. I will make sure that our voters and our taxpayers have roads at the price that is a reasonable price and the quality that we've already decided upon. So Truman was not saying he was going to get the best deal for the voters. He was going to say we're going to get a good deal, and I understand about some of the stuff. So once again, Truman acting reasonably pure. I mean, that's in a corrupt political system, that's about the best you're going to get, and Truman showed that. Yeah. And then when he was president, showed character and courage.
Well, Harry S. Truman's a good place to stop. I mean, give him hell, Harry.
Give him hell, Harry. Yeah, and give him hell, Harry. His words would be tame compared to some of the hell that we're going through right now.
It'd be like purgatory.
Exactly.
Give him purgatory.
Give him purgatory hell. Yeah, yeah.
So, well, thanks, Marvin.
Great
right. Job on the book.
Oh, thank you.